Hi everybody, welcome to your library video. So we're going to keep going on the same theme that we started last week. Can you remember what book I read you last week? You remember it was a biography about Margaret Wise Brown. What's a biography again? A biography is a book about someone's life, right? Sometimes a biography can be really long, and sometimes a biography can be just a skinny little picture book. So last week, we learned more about the life of the real person, Margaret Wise Brown, who wrote some really famous books. This week's book is called A River of Words, the story of William Carlos Williams. So this is also a biography, which means everything in it is true, right? A biography is true, real information about a real person. William Carlos Williams was a poet. He wrote poetry, and I think you might recognize some of his poems. I'm going to read you a couple of them and see if they sound familiar to you. One of his most famous poems is called The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Does that poem sound familiar to you? You remember you read that book, Love That Dog, earlier this year with your classroom teacher? And when you read that book, you learned about some different poets and poems, right? I think Red Wheelbarrow was one of the ones in that book. Here's another one. Probably his most famous poem is called This Is Just to Say. This is one of my favorite poems. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So there you go, at the front of the book there are some of his most famous poems, and then if you go to the back of the book, some of his other most famous poems too. So he was a famous poet. He was also a doctor. He had a full-time job as a doctor, and then he wrote his poetry at night. So we're gonna learn a little bit more about him. It's called A River of Words. That's a typewriter there at the beginning. So he was born more than 100 years ago. Back then they didn't have computers, so he wrote his work on a typewriter. That's kind of what he looked like. So this is a biography of William Carlos Williams. Like the other boys in Rutherford, New Jersey, Willie Williams loved to play baseball and to race his friends up and down the street. But when the other boys went inside, Willie stayed outside. Climbing over the fence in his backyard, he wandered alone through the woods and fields. In those days, just beyond the town, there were still many wild places for Willie to explore. My Willie has sharp eyes. He notices everything, his mother told the neighbors. And it was true. As he walked through the high grasses and along the soft dirt paths, Willie watched everything. When he grew tired, he stretched out near the Passaic River. Gurgle, gurgle, swish, swish, swoosh, gurgle, gurgle. The water went slipping and sliding over the smooth rocks, then poured in a torrent over the falls, then quieted again below. The river's music soothed and excited Willie. Sometimes, as he listened to its perfect tune, he fell asleep. There he is, falling asleep next to the river in New Jersey. As Willie grew older, though, there was less time to wander through the woods and fields or to nap by the river. In high school, Willie had classes and track practice and lots of homework. Willie is always in a hurry, his mother told the neighbors. And it was true. But when Mr. Abbott read poetry to Willie's English class, Willie did not feel hurried. The gentle sounds and shifting rhythms of the poems were like the music of the river. As the teacher read each line, Willie closed his eyes and let them make pictures in his mind. Isn't that cool? So the feeling he got when he fell asleep by the river and kind of heard the sounds of the water rushing by, that was the same feeling he got when he listened to poetry. Because poetry kind of has a rhythm and a music to it, right? One night, Alone in his room, Willie began to write his own poems. At first, he imitated the famous English writers he had learned about in school. He counted the beats in each line and made sure the endings rhymed. Here's one of the early ones he wrote. The archer is awake, the swan is flying, gold against blue, an arrow is lying. Poetry suited Willie. Every night he looked forward to sitting at his desk and writing a few new lines. But after a while, he grew frustrated. He had pictures in his mind that didn't fit exactly into steady rhythms or rhymes. I have never seen a swan or an archer, Willie thought. I want to write about ordinary things. Plums, wheelbarrows and weeds, fire engines, children and trees. Things I see when I walk down my street or look out my window. He says, I will write of leaves and the moon in the treetops. So it's kind of cool, right? He was thinking, I have these things I want to say and they don't necessarily fit into rhymes. I can't necessarily think of something that rhymes. And so that's how he started writing these poems that didn't rhyme. So Willie tried writing a new way. Instead of counting the beats or making the end words rhyme, he let each poem find its own special shape on the page. Here's another poem he wrote. There is a bird in the poplars. It is the sun. The leaves are little yellow fish swimming in the river. So here is something really cool the illustrator did with his poem. I'm just going to hold that for a second so you can see. It says, there is a bird in the poplars. It is the sun. The leaves are little yellow fish swimming in the river. Now when he wrote poems, he felt as free as the Passaic River as it rushed to the falls. Willie's notebooks filled up one after another. My boy is a good writer, his mother said. And it was true. Unfortunately, no one paid much money for poetry, and Willie needed to earn a living. It's still true today. You don't make much money writing poetry for a living. There's a poem he wrote about sparrows. It says, the little sparrows hop ingeniously about the pavement, quarreling with sharp voices over things that interest them. It's another poem he wrote. Willie's mother had told him stories about her older brother Carlos, who was a doctor. When our father died, she told Willie, Carlos's salary provided for our whole family. Willie liked the idea of healing people and of providing for a family, but could he do both and still write poetry? He wrote, this is another poem he wrote, dreams are not a bad thing. I am moved to write poetry. So much depends upon labor. At age 19, Willie went off to study medicine at the university, where he met Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, and Charles Demuth. Ezra and Hilda were studying literature, while Charlie studied painting. The friends spent many afternoons together discussing books, music, and art. The harder Willie's medical training became, the more he enjoyed the time he spent with them. There they are, discussing a painting. And here's another poem he wrote. It's called Among the Rain. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5, gold on a red fire truck, moving, tense, unheeded to gong clang, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. Just kind of like a collage that the illustrator did of his poems. When he graduated, he returned to Rutherford and hung his sign, William C. Williams, Family Medicine. Every morning, Dr. Willie Williams filled his black bag with medicines and instruments and drove off to visit patients in their homes. Every afternoon, he returned to his office, where more patients waited. Here's a poem he wrote about that. They call me and I go. The door opens, I smile. Enter. All day, he delivered babies, healed hurts and bruises, set broken bones, and wrote prescriptions for coughs and fevers. "Dr. Williams is the busiest man in town," said the neighbors. And it was true. But no matter how many babies he delivered, no matter how many sick people he cured, Willie could not stop writing poems. So here is his wheelbarrow poem. "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater besides the white chickens." On his prescription pads, he would scribble a few lines whenever and wherever he could. In those precious times, the rhythm of the river he had rested beside as a child seemed to guide him. Like the water that sometimes ran slow, smooth, and steady, and other times came rushing in a hurried flood, Willie's lines flowed across the page. After his long doctor's day, Willie climbed to the attic where he kept a lamp and a desk filled with letters from his artist friends and notes he'd made about things he'd heard, seen, or done. As the rest of Rutherford put out its lights, Willie took out his pen and his notes. He sat down and looked at the words. And here is a collage from my favorite poem. "This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold." And he shaped these words into poems. So there we go. That's just a little bit of information about who William Carlos Williams was and where he got his ideas for his poems. I hope you liked it.